So thank you, Alan. It had not been my intention this morning to talk about the classical and interwar gold standards, but Robert Skidelsky made an important point with potentially implications for our age. He suggested that the gold standard only worked well when there was a hegemonic power to take charge of its global operation, the implication being we may be in for hard times for a while now. I've always thought that this view was exaggerated. It was, the importance of Britain at the center of the classical gold standard was always exaggerated, in particular by people sitting in Britain and writing in English, and there may be a little bit of historical continuity this morning as well. Modern scholarship, which is code for my work, suggests that international cooperation was important throughout the period, that even before 1913 you had what was essentially a tripolar world with three international currencies managed by three countries. And I think that has rather different implications for what the future may bring and what its operating properties are likely to be, and I'll come back to that. And just to have a little bit more fun with Bob, it was not the French who brought down the Bretton Woods system, but rather the Bank of England cashing in its dollars in the spring of 1971 that forced Richard Nixon to do what he wanted to do anyway, which was to close the gold window. So to turn to the topic du jour, I would agree with the gist of what's been said about Keynes at the Bretton Woods conference so far. He failed in getting agreement on the kind of international monetary and financial system he wanted. In particular, his two fundamental failures were failure to restore symmetry to the international monetary and financial system, and the failure to create an international source of liquidity, what he referred to as Bancor. I would suggest that the first of these two remains a major challenge for policy today. The G20 claims that it's making progress in this direction toward making the international system more symmetric, although I have serious doubts about that claim. The second issue, in my somewhat out of consensus view, remains a non-starter. There isn't going to be a true global currency by the name of special drawing rights or anything else. Instead, the market itself, after a fashion, will solve this problem. So let me talk about the symmetry first. Some of this discussion has left me with the impression that all this talk of international monetary reform is hypothetical, where, in fact, a substantial number of people, including some people in this room, are working full-time on the issue in the context of the Group of 20, which has a working group that is trying to work on issues like the symmetry and liquidity of the international monetary system. So the symmetry initiative revolves around the development of a group of indicators. It started with Secretary Geithner's ill-fated proposal for a 4% of GDP indicator for permissible current account deficits and surpluses, and it has morphed, as these kind of proposals inevitably do, into a much broader set of indicators that can kind of serve as metrics for whether imbalances are sustainable or unsustainable, safe or dangerous, need to be adjusted or not. Why won't these work? My view is that leading indicators of current account sustainability or anything else financial are much better at predicting the last crisis and the last set of problems than the next one. The structure of the markets in the global economy is changing all the time, and I simply do not believe that a mechanical set of indicators is going to help us get much analytical traction on these issues. Moreover, the the G20's indicators will not come with an enforcement mechanism other than peer pressure. And if you want an example of the effectiveness of peer pressure, I would have 4 words for you: growth and stability pact. So the Europeans, in other words, are familiar with these problems of imbalances and the limits of peer pressure. What have they begun to do in response to that? They are now moving toward a somewhat more automatic process where countries have to vote to prevent the imposition of sanctions and ultimately fines rather than having to vote to have them imposed. I think they will ultimately need to move further, and if we are serious about the problem of symmetry in the international system, we as a global community are going to have to move further as well. I suggested about a year ago in a paper written, ironically, I suppose, for the International Monetary Fund, that we should think again about the idea of automatic progressive taxes on reserve accumulation for chronic surplus countries in particular. I called that paper out-of-the-box thoughts on the international financial architecture, and as it turned out, the thoughts were so far out of the box that they didn't get much traction. I do think, nonetheless, that we will have to rely in the end on more than peer pressure to make progress on the symmetry front. On global liquidity and the SDR, I remain deeply skeptical that special drawing rights will play more than a marginal role going forward. There will be some more token SDR issuance, but in my view, only token. And the SDR will not replace national currencies, first and foremost the dollar, as the principal unit used internationally. Why? Well, first of all, because reserve currency status is only one aspect of international currency status. A true international currency has to be used for trade invoicing and settlements, for private international investment as well. That and the use of the unit by central banks tend to come bundled together. And we know, because it's been tried before, notably in the early 1980s, that encouraging private use of the SDR will be devilishly difficult. In fact, the IMF has acknowledged this a couple of months ago. It released a 50-page, single-spaced paper describing what might be needed in order to create private markets in SDRs. Moreover, if something like the SDR was going to become the real international reserve unit, more of that SDR-denominated liquidity would have to be provided in a crisis, in the same manner that the Fed provided $120 billion of dollar swaps and credits after Lehman Brothers. So my question for you, for the SDR advocates, is, would Mr. Strauss-Kahn be authorized to do this over a weekend? As I put it in my book, Exorbitant Privilege, no global government means no global central bank, which means no global reserve and international currency. So more promising, in my view, are the efforts initiated under the Korean presidency of the G20 and now being continued under the French presidency to encourage regional reserve pooling, to systematize ad hoc swaps and credits, and to figure out how the IMF and regional funds like the European Stability Mechanism and the Chiang Mai Initiative, multilateralization, can work together. What I think will replace the current dollar-denominated international monetary and financial system will not be an SDR-based system, but a tripolar system organized around the dollar, the euro, and the Chinese renminbi. So that statement has two controversial aspects to it. The first controversial aspect is my belief that the euro isn't going anywhere. To the contrary, that it will ultimately emerge from its crisis strengthened and poised to ascend to the international stage, and that what the Chinese really want is not an SDR-based system, but an international role for their own currency, so that their own banks and their own firms can do cross-border business in their own currency, just like US banks and firms. And the Chinese are moving to internationalize the renminbi much more quickly and effectively than most people realize. My second controversial implication is that we all will be better off as a result, that the United States having to share its exorbitant privilege as the issuer of the international currency will make the world a safer financial place. The existence of alternatives, 3 alternative international currencies, will mean that the issuers of the reserve and international currencies will feel policy discipline earlier and more regularly. I think that'll be a good thing. The United States, when it next falls prey to financial excesses, when we blow our next bubble, we won't receive as much foreign finance as freely. Foreigners won't give us as much rope with which to hang ourselves. If you want my characterization of the recent financial crisis in a nutshell, it's that there was a contradiction, a dangerous inconsistency between our increasingly multipolar global economy and its still strangely dollar-dominated global monetary and financial system. So the good news, such as it is that the markets are already at work changing this. I think they will change this status quo and move us toward a true tripolar monetary and financial system over the course of the next 10 or so years. The bad news is that history tells us that financial crises occur more along the lines of every 3 years.
Thank you very much, Perry.